Hello and welcome back to the Inquisitor podcast with me, Marcus Kauke. Today, my guest is Roee Hartuv, the chief architect and designer for Winning by Design. Many of you will be aware of their work. I love it. A lot of my friends who share my view that sales should be more humane, it should be more predictable, more effective, and the idea that a 0.2% close rate to a 5% close rate is even remotely acceptable turns all of our stomachs. Well, Roy is a specialist in helping businesses to not make those stupid decisions. A coach who once said to me, Marcus, your business is perfectly designed to deliver precisely the outcomes that you're getting today. And my response was, well, I haven't designed. And the point was made. So you win by design, you lose by not thinking it through and by just following the old norms and doing what you've always done. So, Roy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, would you mind giving us a couple of minutes on your history and background so people understand a little bit about your pedigree and why you're qualified to have this particular conversation?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, actually, I started my career in the Air Force, and I was a combat helicopter pilot. And I think that's very relatable because I took a lot of the principles of what I was taught when I became a pilot, which is execute certain processes again and again and again until perfection, and then go out on your mission to do that. So that this is, I think, what drew me to the sales part and specifically on building processes. So I graduated from the Air Force and then I went into sales. I started my career in defense. So back in 2006, did that for again, big enterprise company, corporate company. Did that for 6 years and then decided to go into the world of startups and high tech and fast growing companies. I continued in the sales leadership roles, but I was always drawn into building an architect, different processes, understanding why certain things work and certain things do not work. And that's how 3 years ago I found myself joining Winning by Design as a revenue architect. And a revenue architect is basically a consultant. We help companies build sustainable growth strategies. This is what I'm doing today, helping and working with some fantastic companies on their go-to-market strategies, sales processes, skills, etc.
Okay, so let's explore a couple of things. The first one I'd like to explore is actually designing the business, because most people design the business top down and they design their sales in terms of what they can do to the customer. Why is this fundamentally wrong?
Usually, when you say top down, you're looking and focusing on where you want to hit. Let's, give a practical example. When leadership executives define what is their growth rate or what their expected revenue next year, they just look at the numbers. Hey, either I triple or I double, right? That's what investors are looking for me to achieve. And that's going to be my target next year. And you build an entire company and commercial organization based on that. All right, I need to triple my revenue. I need to double my revenue. This is how many people I need to hire, and these are new accounts, the new accounts that I need to build. And okay, if you have a target, you have a goal. All right, so if I'm doing this year, I need to double the headcount in order to achieve the results, right? This is how we tend to think. That is fundamentally
Hmm.
wrong.
That seems to be very expensive and remarkably uh, inefficient, because if you're doing it that way, that's like building your plan from where you're starting to where you want to end up instead of working backwards.
That's right.
Why is it that they're not building from the ground up, from the people who actually have to do the work? and get their input, because it seems to be that none of that seems to be important in many of these organizations, because you just have to look at the massive underperformance and the significant pressure that so many of these sales organizations are under. And the net result is the impact it has on churn. You look at the lifetime value of these customers, they're diminishing rapidly. I'd be surprised if the break even hasn't increased dramatically because of the increase in cost of sale.
Yeah. And exactly that. Like the first thing that we look, or maybe the last thing, that's the underlying, it's the cost, right? Because, all right, churn is churn 20% churn or 10% churn. What's the difference, right? The difference is how much resources, meaning money, you need to invest in order to replace the customers that you lost. So at the end of the day, it's all about cost. And
Well,
can you do efficiently by, for example, you just said churn, right? By focusing on churn or retention in order to not to spend so much money replacing the customers that you lost.
well, 15% churn means you have to replace 49% of your customers every 3 years. So people get, I'm sure, bored of me ranting about this, but let's take one bad lead all the way through to closed lost. How many touches are required along the way, typically, before you get your hands on redesigning things?
I don't know exactly the type of the amount of touch points because it really changes, right? If you're doing inbound, so the prospect comes to you much more educated, so it's less touch points. If you're doing outbound, right, you need to have a lot of other touch points. But I did do an analysis, and again, we like to look at cost, like to measure efficiency. I did this a few months ago with a client of ours, and they had a lot of uh, leads or deals dropping off towards the end,
Mhm.
right? Post POC piloting, and we measured how much each customer cost them to get to, on average, right, to get to the end of a POC,
Yep.
and it was $43,000.
Yeah, that's
It's an
normal.
extreme case, I think, because they were spending left and right on acquisition, and they were dropping off and not qualifying, good enough. But 43,000, and when we took that numbers and showed that to the sellers, hey guys, if you are taking bad lead, as you started this question, all the way to the end of the POC, and you successfully finish the POC and they're still not converting, you're losing $45,000 on each one of those on average.
Mhm. Wow. Well,
Unsustainable.
and in all honesty, that number really doesn't surprise me, because when you look at the hidden costs of sale and the friction that is entirely preventable, the perceived risk that is entirely preventable, and the amount of opportunities that go into closed lost no decision, because the salespeople are trying to do something to the customer instead of design their process to align with the customer to facilitate making the right decision. Because that's the only possible reason why any buyer will want to speak to a salesperson. They want to make the right decision, and they don't want to make the wrong decision.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to make the right decision badly. If they knew how to make the decision and they were 100% confident in it, would they speak to a salesperson?
Of course not.
So that is our only job. We have no other function as far as the buyer is concerned. So how do we design our sales motion so it aligns with that and the buyers, where the buyer is, and we meet them where they are or where they're going to be instead of where we wish they were?
What you said reminds me, everybody knows of FOMO, right? Fear of
Yeah.
missing out. But there's FUMO, fear of messing up,
Yeah.
right? So people are more scared of messing up than they are of not taking a decision. And that's
Right.
something that we need to understand as sellers, as an organization, right? Exactly that. Like, yeah. So
Well, this then speaks to my research as well. Having interviewed hundreds of C-suite, CFOs, procurement, the syntax in every single case when they are making an important decision is, first of all, they filter for risk. And they want to remove all risk. They don't want to reduce it. They want to remove it where possible. Reducing it is a very bad second option. If you can remove risk, that then in the brain removes uncertainty. And the brain's default setting when it is uncertain is to go to the worst case scenario. So it anticipates buyer's remorse if you create uncertainty in the sale. Which then brings me to the next point, which is the jolt effect research tells us that 31% of all pipeline generated in the SaaS industry was typically generated or ended up in close loss no decision because the seller misread a moment where their playbook tells them to try and handle objections. And again, I'd be really curious what you have learned through your design and through your research as to what we do as vendors, as sellers, that cause the buyer's brain to perceive us as a risk. And so we never even get to the next two filters, which are opportunity cost and then a very bad third, value.
I think, first of all, if I try to answer that, it's the mindset. We were all taught, and even me as a young seller, hey, we need to manage the deal.
Yeah.
We need to take the buyer from left to right or from
Buyer
top.
control.
Buyer control. We're in control, right? And that's why we have deal management methodologies such as MEDIC, right? It's all about, when you think of it, it's all about the seller.
Yeah,
And it's the
absolutely.
information that is important for me. So
Yeah.
my mindset, by the way, it reminds me, when I was a young seller, I was introduced to Band.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go on.
What, a young seller that just introduced to Band, what is the first question that you ask?
Budget.
What is the budget? How much budget have you set aside for this project?
How much can I take from your pocket
Exactly.
without having delivered anything that's even remotely interesting, valuable, or timely?
And it's not even, let's take it to the, like, we're selling SaaS. SaaS is affordable, right? All of us are utilizing tens of different softwares at any given moment, from Zoom to Gmail to whatever we're using. So everything is practically affordable. It's based on priority. And am I, as a seller, explaining why this is a priority for them? So the mindset of being seller centric to a customer centric.
Yeah.
How it can help you make a better decision, if it means, even if it means that I'm not going to sell the S out of you, and you know what's in your best interest. And I think this is the first thing that you need to look into. The second thing is, we like to talk about impact. A lot of the sellers that we see, and we analyze, right, a lot of calls, each one of us that's part of the engagement, analyze calls. A lot of the sellers are feature selling, right?
Mm.
They ask the situation question, they hear a certain pain, right? Because we were all taught of identifying pain and the problem. All right, you have this problem, here's the solution, here's the feature for you. But we do not continue that discussion, which should naturally go into the impact. So you have a certain pain, what is the impact that you're trying to achieve? And we're not, most of the sellers are not doing that. We're staying at that feature kind of level. And that means that when we're setting features, it comes down to pricing and competition. That's what we usually see. And if we focus on the business impact, the business outcome that we're trying to achieve, and even I would say emotional impact, then we are becoming that buyer-centric, customer-centric approach, which is, to your question, how we would start building the process from the buyer himself and not the seller.
So how do you go about doing that? Because a lot of people ask me about that as well, and I'm curious about your take. So how do you start with the buyer and build out from there?
In a lot of cases, we try to, you know, understand what they're going through based on the problems. So in a lot of cases, we start off with understanding the ICPM persona.
Hmm.
Understanding where they're coming from, what are their pain points, trying to see how specific ICPs or persona make buying decision. We need to understand the stakeholders involved in that process. And once we understand that, we start crafting out what is the right sales process. There's no other way for us to explain processes without making them very complex. So we tend to look at sales
Mhm.
process from left to right, from that initial discovery call all the way to a signature. It's a linear process. We know, however, that in a lot of cases the sales process is not linear. It goes up and down, back and right, multiple stakeholders. You jump back 3 places, etc. Unfortunately, we're a bit limited when we're trying to design a simple process that we could all leverage, and that's where um, experienced salespeople naturally understand that process and where they are. So, yeah.
Again, I think if we design humane systems, if we think consequentially and we think beyond the short term, then we can actually start building stuff that's really powerful and very effective.
Mm-hmm.
So applying integrative thinking, for example, where you are able to take two opposing forces and they've appear to have completely different interests, but then find the common ground. Well, I think that's a huge part of our job in complex enterprise sales, certainly. And if people are making important decisions that are strategically important, that are going to have a knock-on effect to users, to other people within the value chain, to shareholders, they need to understand all those different moving parts. And it's not good enough to just turn up, vomit up some features and functions. And let me be absolutely clear to everybody, there is not a single BANT question. And as yet, I have to find anyone who delivers a medic-based question that serves the customer in advancing their understanding of their context, giving them clarity on their situation, empowering them to move forward to make the right decision. Because medic, like so many of these systems, are all about vendor control of the sale and the buyer. And no buyer wants to be closed handled, coerced, manipulated, or convinced. So I think what we also have to do at the same time as we design all of this is maybe have a little chat about leadership and management thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and get them off this short term. How do we do that in a quarterly environment?
Are you focused on the ICs, the individual contributors, or frontline managers? And
Well, I'm thinking here in terms of senior leadership, first of all, the board, C-suite, shareholders, because if they really were interested in shareholder value, instead of flipping the financial instrument, I would have thought having 5 times more profitability, having 20% more daily production per employee, and not having to have that land army at the top of the funnel to try and feed the machine would represent much better value for shareholders
yeah,
than over assigning quota by 300% and having to churn vast amounts of headcount and then have the governance, the HR, the technology, the data, the security, the IT, the management, the leadership, and then have to listen to all the excuses in board meetings.
yeah,
Why not just not do any of that stuff in the first place and design the business as if you mean to keep it and make a profit from it?
yeah. that's a problem, right? There's a paradox because once a company goes through the VC route,
Mm-hmm.
this is where the different business models of the two types of stakeholders collide.
Mm-hmm.
I would say two sides, sometimes it's the same side. Let's talk about the VCs. The VC's business model is to take somebody else's money invested in, let's say, startup companies, software as a service companies, and then 5 to 7 years return that 2 to 3 times X as the initial amount was.
Mm-hmm.
In order to do that, in order to lower risk, they want to do that. They want to give money and get it back as fast as possible. And we all know, right? They need one or two companies to be 20x, and the rest probably much lower, and the majority lose the money. Companies, however, should have a opposite or a different kind of goal because they have a different business model. They have different shareholders. And you would say, who is the shareholders? Is the actual shareholders or the customers, right? We could talk about that, but basically their business model is to make a profit, to build a company that at some point will create profits. And sometimes that collides. Again, when the VCs, the investors come in, and usually they have seats in the board and they have a majority at some point. And again, their business model is to give you money and get that as fast as possible. And the way to do that is to grow and do an IPO and an exit.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to get to the highest valuations. And the way valuations are done or have been done until recently is by growth rate. So the faster you grow, the higher the valuation is, which the investors say, hey, I want you to grow as fast as possible, which brings us to grow at all costs. Let's pour money at the top of the funnel to generate more leads, to generate new ARR, which increase the valuation of companies. And that in a lot of cases, as you just pointed out, goes against the goal of a company becoming profitable.
Well, again, valuation is often affected by things like churn rate, CAC, cost of customer acquisition. And more often than not, the thinking, I think, is something that we should probably discuss. If we played the numbers game, which appears to be the leading management preference, then you're attracting a lot of TAM. You're not necessarily picking out the ICP only. Every lead that comes in, and this is based on actually old data, so it's going to be worse than this. In 2018, it took 33 to 46 dial attempts to get hold of an executive in cold calling. I'm seeing conversion rates of 0.2%. So they have to make 10,000 dials to get one customer over the line.
Mm-hmm.
That therefore represents a huge amount of unproductive work that doesn't yield contribution to the top or bottom line. It just, in fact, what it does, it subtracts from the bottom line because it incurs cost and adds no value. So that opportunity cost represents a loss to shareholders. It also means that they have to then over-assign quota. There is always a very high churn rate, and the overemphasis on those metrics then tends to mean that the environment is hyper-stressed. At the end of the quarter, people then drag deals forward because they're under pressure from their management to do so. And that creates an extra tariff in terms of prospecting, and it becomes a vicious circle. My challenge to anyone who thinks like that is this. In a world where money was free, you could kind of get away with that. Money is now quite expensive by comparison. If you started with interest at zero, and now you're paying 5, 8% on 100 million. That's a big hole because that comes out of profits. And many of these founders are under enormous pressure to meet these growth targets. But my question is this: the one person who matters the most has been forgotten, which is the customer. If you don't start with the customer and their job to be done, which is to get the outcome that they intended when they invested with you, then when we try and impose our two jobs to be done, one is to build a profitable business and the other is to satisfy shareholders, then we find ourselves in a very difficult position. But that's our job. It's to satisfy all three. Now, how do we do that by design?
I think, first of all, understanding that these are your stakeholders is the first point. The second thing is to look at data and to look at what we are talking here. And we're throwing different statistics and numbers that we saw out there, but each company has to have an understanding of how their go-to-market teams, their commercial teams actually operate. A lot of the companies that we work with don't know that number, the cost of acquisition. They have a high level overview because just taking sales and marketing spend divided by the number of customers, that's the cost of acquisition, which is, it's accurate, but it's too high level, right?
Yeah.
We need to understand, like you said, SDR, when we're doing an outbound process, we need to look at how much that costs us compared to everything else that we're doing. Do we have both inbound and outbound, all these? So we need to look at the numbers in order to truly evaluate what's working and what we need to stop doing. Once we do that, we can start evaluating, okay, here's what we see, and this is sustainable or unsustainable, unscalable.
How much time do you tend to find that sales organizations can recover when they look at what they should stop doing, what they can take out of their sales process that gets in the way?
In a lot of cases, they don't recover. Like, look at the number of, and let's look at public companies, because that's, you just saw a few examples out there, the companies that were bought. We all seen the market cap valuation drop by 80 to 90% of companies. You know, WalkMe was just bought at 1.5 billion, and 2 years ago they were worth 3 or 4 times as much. So these companies, and WalkMe, I don't think they were ever profitable. In a lot of cases, it's too late. There are predictions that, based on Dealroom, the platform that tracks the fundings, in 2022 there were 1,200 software as a service unicorns, private ones. Usually these companies do an IPO or exit in a matter of a year or two, but we haven't had any IPOs, right? Because now companies need to actually provide a profit to do an IPO, or at least show a path to becoming profitable. There are hundreds of companies out there that will not be able to do that switch. It's too late for them. They've built an entire engine that has very high cost, and transitioning and focusing on the customer, focusing on retention, etc., just won't do it for them.
So is that part of the reason why Warren Buffett is saying that he thinks that 40% of the value of stocks is going to evaporate?
That's part of it, yeah.
Wow, interesting. And with the advent of AI, lots of people applying old thinking to this new tool in the same way that they did with the fax and the mobile phone and SMS and everything, and email and everything else. And very few people seem to be using AI especially effectively at a granular level down to an individual salesperson. Because I mean, my inbox is getting what, 40 bad messages a day. And the pattern is, you can see the pattern of who they've been trained by or who they've read, because you get so many of them. Professional buyers see all of the tactics that we teach in techniques training, your negative reverses, your porcupine closes, and all of that rubbish. And they know when they're being played. And this, I think, is part of the problem that we've got, because buyers are so savvy to the bad technique and the overemphasis of technique, over creating real human relationships that allow or that empower buyers to get their job done. That's why they come to us, for no other reason. And the idea that they care about our share price is insane. None of your employees care about your share price unless they have shares, because they're not the ones benefiting from it if you're a private company owned by a VC.
Yeah.
So the idea that people are motivated by shareholder value, shareholders are, I get that, but no one else is. And we have to integrate all of them because we need them to deliver the shareholder value. So what would you suggest to a founder who's at that point, they're at that crossroads in their business where they can either take funding or they can maybe rethink and pause and then design their business so when they go for funding, it's as fuel instead of oxygen?
Yeah. So a few things there. You touched on the AI, and I just want to comment on that. Putting
Please.
AI or tools on top of bad processes just amplifies the process, right? So instead of me, if I'm an SDR, and traditionally I could write 25 personal messages a day, with AI I can go to 100. But if I'm not using the right techniques, or I'm not connecting to the other person on that individual level and just using the frameworks that I was taught, I'm just amplifying the process from 25 to 100. So that's putting AI, etc. To your point on how I would advise a founder, this is a tough one, right? Because at the end of the day, we need to, in order for companies to grow, they need external funding. And there's a power dynamic here between an investor and a founder. And I believe that in a lot of cases, the motivations and the goals are different, or should be different, right? You can say, hey, I'm a founder, I'm a first-time founder. I just want to exit as soon as possible. Customers are just a means to become rich, right? Some cases like that. But it's hard because, again, they're shareholders, they sit on the board, and they own 25% of the company. And again, they're intelligent people, the investors. What I would recommend, though, is to come with a plan before you raise capital. So don't raise capital and close on a certain amount just because this is what the investors want, but come with a plan. Hey, I'm looking to raise 30 because this is my plan to grow. And we see that in a lot of cases, investors are coming, oh, you want 30, but I'll give you 50 because I want you to grow faster. It doesn't work like that. And this is where it's hard for the founder, especially first-time founders, to say, hey, thank you, Mr. Investor, but this is the plan. This is how I'm going to build based on a more efficient, productive way. It might be slower, but it's a more healthy and sustainable growth.
Well, this is where we've got to overcome the more is better fallacy. More is not better. More is more. Better is better.
Yeah.
And the key is to work out what you are trying to achieve. What is getting in the way of you achieving that? Stop doing that thing. Free up the resources, free up the money, free up the time, free up the mental bandwidth so that you can think your way to what will work better. Redesign your processes. I mean, one of my favorite activities, which always causes palpitations, is the amber, red, and blacklist. If any process fails to deliver the intended outcome, 20% or more of the time, i.e. only has an 80% success rate or worse, then I want to triage that, because that to me suggests that there is room for improvement. If it's between 50 and 80%, it goes on the amber list. If it's between 5 and 50%, it goes on the red list. And then if it's below 5% or worse, it goes on the blacklist. The amber list, basically within 3 months, we need to have a 75% improvement. The red list, within 1 month, we have to get up to 80%. And the blacklist, we stop doing immediately. We do not do another thing. We cancel the contracts, we stop spending money, and then we redesign the process so it delivers 80% of the time the intended outcome. Now, that doesn't mean the individual component does, but if I start a sales motion, I want to know that 80% of them end up being viable prospects who then end up converting or being a clear future next step. If I design my process like that, then it puts the onus on me to be very different. So, for example, I might start looking for customers for life instead of people I can transact with this month. I show up very differently. My pipeline focuses on people who will convert over the next 6 to 36 months and become actively looking in that period, not people who are going to convert in the next 0 to 6 months.
On the black part, stop doing what doesn't work. You'd be amazed how hard it is.
No, I wouldn't.
We were all taught, let's experiment, let's fail fast, try different things. But stopping what doesn't work, that is so hard. Where I get into clashes with CEOs, there's one recommendation that keeps on coming up. So a lot of our companies, I don't know for what reason it is, but they're trying out different things, and a lot of them say, hey, we want now to go into enterprise.
Yeah.
That's we want to go whale hunting, bigger deals, of course, longer lifetime value,
Higher cost of pursuit.
in a lot of cases, it doesn't work. So they land 2 enterprise accounts, and for them, that's a sign, okay, that's working. Let's continue to go chase after enterprise. And when I come in and I start asking questions, do you have an internal, and we're talking about earlier stage companies, do you have an internal legal team that can actually review the contract? Because selling into enterprise, you probably take their contract. Do you have a security team that can go over due diligence by an enterprise account to make sure that their data is safe? And so on and so on. And usually what I hear is, no, we don't have that. We have an external legal team and security. Yeah, our chief technology officer gets on those calls. I'm sucking away from their time.
But we're very lucky.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have that, right? And then, so in a lot of cases, my recommendation to the CEO is, hey, stop doing enterprise. You're not ready.
Yeah.
And this is where usually it's like, how can you say that? I have 2 successful customers. This is an indication that we're ready and we're valuable to these types of customers. And I'm like, no. In a lot of cases, it causes friction with my customers, because stop doing what doesn't work is really, really hard.
Well, and the sunk cost fallacy. And in Buddhism, the Buddha talked about attachment being the root to all misery. He was bang to rights. I mean, 3,000 years ago, spot on. Yeah, the reality is that as human beings, we are very easily misled by our perception rather than by having perspective. And as a result of that, we have a tendency to over-assign far too much value to stuff that actually we shouldn't be attributing that value to. So, for example, cold outreach. I understand the logic of it, but when you have a 0.2% conversion rate, that means 99.8% of your activity was wasted. You spent that money, those people's lives were sucked up pursuing something that could not, would not, or should not ever have been in the top of your funnel. So the most obvious question then is, how do we not attract non-ICP prospects? How do we sell hot, not cold? How do we get invited in through the front door instead of having to swim through a crocodile-infested moat, climb up a wall while they pour fiery oil on top of us, saw through a barred window, and then take someone hostage so that we can tell them about our features and functions? It makes more sense to get invited in through the front door, doesn't it?
It reminds me of a discussion that I had this morning with a client. We've been back and forth on SDR specifically, and we came to a conclusion that the most logical step for us to do is to do a certain process that means integrate a new process that means that we will have twice as much SDRs as we need. So the current SDR team, we can reduce it by half if we do a certain change. And I'm like, great, we're making progress. We finally reached an understanding of how we can improve. And coming exactly to what you said, hey, we want more educated, more qualified inbound customers that within our ICP that actually have problems, instead of SDRs focusing on doing outreaches to random individuals right out there that might or might not use our platform. And I was like, that's a good sign. And what I heard is like, I don't know what to do. Like, it's a big step for us. We need to let go of a lot of people. We're talking about 30 to 40 people that they need to let go. They have a big SDR team.
Well, do they have to let them go? Can't they redeploy them and maybe restructure their sales and marketing go-to-market function so that they're actually supporting the customer and creating really powerful pods and creating a succession plan? I mean, that's what that represents in terms of upside, because then they don't have to go out and recruit the next generation of salespeople the next time. They can create them for next to nothing.
It's a fantastic point. That's part of it. But we have built a process that we believe is more efficient and more productive. So it would make sense to
Okay.
let go and spend less resources on acquisition. Yeah.
Well, that's legit. I mean, I firmly believe that the top of the funnel engine that most cold go-to-market functions have is redundant. And within 8 months, you can replace it with a hot go-to-market function with a fraction of the number of people using an aligned go-to-market function that involves product, it involves marketing, it involves sales, it involves CS, and it involves finance and innovation. If you don't have all of those aligned, then chances are they're going to be working at odds with one another, all thinking that they're succeeding, and then the company doesn't make a profit, doesn't grow, and then ends up being diluted.
And now we're hitting the point that you like to talk about, like egos and leadership. And all right, I'm a sales leader now. Instead of managing 80, I'm managing only 40 or 50. What does that mean?
Well, it means that you're making a profit, which is unheard of in the tech industry almost, isn't it?
That's right.
There was a study that came out about 2-3 years ago of the top 100 SaaS companies and what their median profit margin was, and it was 0%. And if you took Salesforce out, it was heavily into the negative.
Yeah.
So if you want to have a sustainable business, it probably makes sense to design it so it does make a profit, doesn't it?
Go figure, huh? A
Ah,
company that needs to focus on profit.
well, having customers come back. I mean, I keep seeing all these headlines about churn and everything else. If you're losing 50% of your customers every 3 years, why not just plug the leaky bucket and keep 50% and then continue to grow on top? When Tom Williams ran a win-back campaign when he was in the medical space in the US, they had a 90% win-back, but they raised their retention rate from 83 to 94%, which meant that every month they collected another 14% of revenue, which they got to keep.
Yeah.
Now, why are we doing things that create the conditions where customers feel they have to leave.
Here's another thing. What, from my experience, focusing on, hey, let's sell just within our ICP.
Mhm.
You know what is a common reaction that I get? That people, certain type of maybe less experienced people, leaders, but it's like, okay, if I need to sell within my ICP, then I have half the pipeline that I need.
Brilliant.
I had a regional head of EMEA, in order to fill the pipeline, went to sell to Africa and to African companies, which is great, but this is not, this is an American company. And again, and he was tasked in selling into the core European markets, right? The DACH, like Germany and France and UK markets. But he wasn't able to fill the pipeline, and he had somebody on the ground in Nigeria that closed all the financial banks in Nigeria for him. Fantastic, but that's outside of the ICP. Like, they cannot pay that amount; it's too expensive for them. And when I told him, hey, you got to cut this. Like, you can't sell into African countries. It's outside of your ICP. He was like, I can't do that because that's half my pipeline.
Mhm. Well, again, this is the point. If you sell to the TAM or market to the TAM, you will fill the top of the funnel with non-buyers, people who cannot buy.
Yeah.
With non-prospects, people who you should not and must not ever sell to, because if you do, it will be an act of mis-selling, and they will open tickets for your CS or customer complaints department very early. Many of them will churn, and you will never make break even, but you will have incurred a very high cost of customer acquisition. The ripple effect is, and this is real data, so 33 to 46 dial attempts for cold. For a warm inbound, it was 6 to 11 follow-ups. I heard data a couple of weeks ago that it was 18 to 21 now, because people are not responding. They're, as soon as they've made the inquiry, then their emails are just being bombarded. They're not taking phone calls. So you have to do a lot of follow-up touch attempts. When you finally get through, it's 14 attempts where you have an effective, and then 7 out of 8 first meetings. Sorry, it takes 14 effectives to get one first meeting, and 7 out of 8 first meetings do not result in a second.
Yeah.
That begs the question, why are we not converting to second meetings? Is it because we've got people, the wrong people at the top of the funnel, or are we doing something to cause real buyers to not buy from us? Well, if we can plug those two leaks, we've probably increased our bottom of the pipeline by about 31%, which is the equivalent of how much we're actually closing at the moment. That's the equivalent of doubling sales at zero cost.
Yeah.
Win backs, close loss, no decisions. All of those, you've already paid for the leads. You don't need to spend more money attracting top of the funnel when you've already paid for those leads. If they're win backs, you're probably already on their payment system, and you don't have to go through the due diligence of IT security, compliance, anti-slavery, get onto their finance system.
Marcus, who do you recommend to work on those win backs, those undecided, those companies?
If you're going to do win back campaigns, often it really helps to have senior executives do it, because they're deaf to what's really going on. One of my favorite syntax is this. The first thing you do is you go through the call recordings of customer success, because they speak to customers 6 to 8 hours a day. Salespeople speak to customers 3 minutes a day, or SDRs do. So they've got hours and hours and hours of small data. It's the throwaway comment. And what we're really interested in is creating a montage of what customers are actually saying, both good and bad, because that's the ammunition that you need to take to your board. So this is where the CRO or the head of sales needs to partner up with CS. They interrogate the recordings, then they interview the CS agents about patterns, experiences that they have. And then the most important thing that they can do, customer interviews. Now, either a third party from outside or a senior executive who's not been involved in the accounts. They need to have a jobs to be done style customer interview. So there is a very particular framework to the questions. And the objective is to understand the buyer's journey, understand the experience they had and why they left. When we get that data, the gifts that come out of it, first of all, we can quickly plug the leaky bucket. So we can identify those customers who are at risk of churn and stop that from happening. So if you're operating at a 15% churn rate, imagine getting another 15% of revenue every month for free. Yeah. And when you do that, it gets even better, because once you've got that data and you've run it for about 4 months, you're starting to get instant pipeline with a 26% win rate. But now you take that to your channel partners, because now you can scale. If you want rapid growth, apply the lessons from Winback, which tell you about problems with the product. Do you know, in the US health industry, 24% of all inquiries come to salespeople because people struggle to find the thing they're looking to buy on the website. 1 in 4. They could just be handing over a credit card number, and instead they take up an agent's time 24% of the time. That's insane, isn't it? Well, if we do these interviews and we're constantly reviewing our ICP every 90 days, we're not going to make those stupid mistakes, and those ripple effects never happen.
Another technique that we like to recommend is customer advisory boards.
Yeah.
So interviews is one-on-ones, right?
Yeah.
Advisory boards. Hey, we're meeting once a month, once every 2 months. In exchange, you're getting, whether it's you just want to support the cause, the company, because you like engaging with us, or we give you Amazon gift cards or whatever it is, right? But customer advisory board, having those group discussions and analyzing that on a recurring basis. So that's a good one. And it's not only one, right? You can have customer advisory board for this segment, for this industry,
Absolutely.
or whatever it is. So that's a classical technique. One other thing that, when we're talking about the win backs and etc., marketing teams tend to think of themselves as only top of the funnel.
Yeah. They're not. Anything that touches the customer is marketing.
That's right.
Anything.
I remember back in business school, and I didn't understand that at that time. Our professor told us that sales is one part of marketing. It plugs into the marketing team. The marketing team should have a complete view of the customer journey, and sales is only one part of that. And as a seller, I couldn't. Young seller, I was like, it was my master, so I had some sales experience, and I was like, how is that possible? I was taught that sales were the top guys, like we're the number one customer relationship manager, and marketing just hands over the leads. And it took me some time to really understand what did that mean. So once you have marketing, take responsibility for the churned account, for the lost accounts, for people that are not ready to engage, or still need to be nurtured. If marketing takes the lead, this is, again, that's money for us just to grab.
But again, we now have the friction and the structural tension between sales, marketing, and finance. Marketing and IT and finance. We've got CS, who essentially have become the whipping boy for all of this, because they get blamed for most of the churn. When in fact, if we hadn't sold to that customer, they would never have been a churn risk in the first place. And the only reason we sold to them was because we were desperate, because we had 3,000 accounts to in our territory, and we had to speak to all of them because of some ludicrous dictum from above that says it's a numbers game. It's not. If you've got 3,000 accounts, you've got 55 that matter. You've got to find those 55, and then you've got to cultivate the relationships within those 55 so that they become your ideal customers.
Mhm.
Those ideal customers, if you had 8 to 12 of those, would keep you in clover for the rest of your career.
Yeah.
Think like that. And if every rep in the company had 8 to 12 ideal customers, how many of these companies do you reckon would have any problem making their IPO as a unicorn?
Mhm. Mhm. Which brings us back to the leadership problem.
Absolutely.
Like what we saw in 2019, 2020, 2021, the industry grew so fast. We have a lot of sellers out there that were promoted now to like frontline managers or second line managers that don't have that understanding that when everything was going well, that companies bought left and right, you didn't need to know what you're doing. So we have this layer of middle or lower management doesn't see that way. So that's a gap that we currently are
It's the lost generation.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Disney had exactly the same problem. Kids who grew up in the 80s, Disney referred to as the lost generation because they didn't have any good Disney films. And so they
Talk about
really,
me.
yeah, well, they really struggled to then sell princesses and merchandise. Um, so one of my partners, interestingly enough, did the research on this. So he's the world's leading expert on princesses. But there's a parallel here because with the way people think in business, it's exactly the same thing. We've got a lost generation of middle managers who are individual contributors who grew up in an era where it was about revenue at any cost, and it didn't matter how you went about doing it, because you were probably going to have left and flipped the business before it mattered. When BlackRock, Tiger, and Y Combinator changed the rules in Feb of 23, and they said you have to collect cash, you have to actually make a profit. There's 15 years of sales, management, and leadership with no idea how to do that. And they've still got to do triple, triple, double, double, double.
Yeah.
So if you're in that kind of situation and you're facing those targets, it's no wonder you're feeling stressed and possibly just a little bit isolated.
Yeah.
So what are the questions they should be asking themselves, but they're not?
One of the things that you said that I really liked is you broke down like the conversions and the actual numbers. This is what they need to ask themselves. What is the do I need 14? I think you in your example you said like I need 14 opportunities and I close just one. Do I actually need the 14? Can I lower it down? So these are the questions. Again, for coming back from what we believe at winning by design, look at the numbers, consider that as a science.
Yeah.
And once you look at the numbers, ask the questions on the actual numbers, and then you'll find out what you need to do in order to grow.
The syntax that we've adopted for the ally method sounds to be pretty much identical to yours, which is what is the outcome that we are trying to accomplish? For that to be possible, what do we need to stop doing that is preventing us? Where are the constraints? What are the things that are within our control over which we actually have agency, and we can remove that friction, that risk, that obstacle?
Yeah.
Once we've done that, what really works? Can we find it from some other industry? Talent creates and genius steals. I can't recommend highly enough looking outside of your industry for other sectors that do stuff really well. Once you've worked out how to do that, test it before you scale it, because this is, again, the rule of never test a river with both feet. You want to make sure it works and there are no nasty ripple effects. Once you've done that, then multiply it like crazy. And it takes a little bit more effort at the beginning. You have to put some real thought into it and be consequential in your thinking, because it's not just you who is affected, it's all the users, the person who has to maintain it, the person who's going to pay for the renewal. How are you going to be in contact with that person? So it's not just a drive-by shooting turning up for the check, because it ain't going to happen. Okay, you've got to think as your customer, and you've got to plan all of this. So in wrapping up, Roee, Help people get a real sense of why the plan, why the systems are so critical, and what they do in order to make life simpler, easier, more predictable.
Again, I'll connect that to the numbers. If you don't have a process, if you don't have a plan in place, you can't measure. If you can't measure, you can't understand what's working well and where you need to improve. And that's why if you're, you know, rolling the dice and trying to do certain things without a process, like, one guy closes one way, the other guy closes a deal the other, and then the other one interacts with a customer in another way. When you standardize that, have a plan, have a process, you can start measuring, you can start seeing where you have problems and then improve over time.
The one thing I would take issue with there, and that's probably another podcast entirely, which is quite exciting, is this. I think we have to get away from technique. We need to start looking at meta skills. The technique then, the danger with technique is the intent behind it, because it becomes a weapon. It becomes a way of trying to control the buyer, control the moment, control the sale, convince, coerce. So what I would suggest is that rather than focusing on the technique of closing, for example, look at what the outcome is that the buyer wants and create a process that encourages the buyer to make that happen voluntarily. Because the best close is the one where the buyer says, okay, let's get started. Here's my credit card number. We really like that. That's a great outcome. What we don't like is where we have to ask for the credit card number. Yeah. So how do we build the process so it's that way?
It's an interesting conversation, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we'll be able to I'll be able to answer that, because that's a big question. The reason why I keep coming back to processes, because we need to create something for normal sellers.
Yeah. The middle.
The middle, exactly. Like the 40%. We call them the 40%.
Okay.
The middle level. Because you were saying 20 are talented, the top performance, 40% are in the middle, and 40, yeah, underperforming. So we like to focus on that 40%.
Well, in my experience, actually, almost everyone is trainable if you can be bothered to take the time to understand what drives them intrinsically. Because they hired these people because they obviously made some, met some sort of quality standard. But then management, middle management is the real problem here. Roy, this has been fascinating, and I hate to end it now, but I'm conscious that you probably have other things on. I would love to have you back because I think this is a really powerful discussion. I think if the audience hasn't got value from it, I'd be amazed. Excellent. So how can people get hold of you?
LinkedIn, Roee Hartuv, Roee
Yep.
Hartuv, Winning by Design. Yeah, feel free to reach out.
And what are the books that you guys have published? Because there's some
So
brilliant.
the recent book is called Revenue Architecture by our founder Jaco, explaining the models that govern recurring revenue businesses. Our mission at Winning by Design is to standardize how recurring revenue businesses operate. And the book is our understanding, based on working with hundreds of companies, how those principles and models operate in recurring revenue businesses.
Highly recommended read as well. I've just started it. Exceptional. And the work that you guys do, the models, check out Winning by Design. I mean, they really do know their stuff. And if you look at the people who are developing predictable pipeline, the ones who are delivering revenue certainty, they have systems and processes in place which they can replicate. They adopt the scientific method. They experiment. They do everything in small sprints. They don't do stupid things like suddenly drop a system on and then expect everyone to go with it. They test it. And this is the whole premise behind this idea of architecting and designing your business. If you want to get the result that you want, you have to design that. It doesn't happen by chance. Hope is a terrible strategy. Luck is cumulative, but luck is preparation meeting opportunity. And what we are all about over at the Ally Method and Principle Selling is all about tapping into the eighth and ninth wonders of the world. The eighth wonder of the world is compound interest. Those who understand it earn it, those who don't pay it. And the ninth wonder of the world is the human superpowers of communication and cooperation. If you can combine those two things, you can build an absolutely rock solid pipeline, but a hot pipeline that starts with close rates north of 20% and goes up north of 90%. Sales cycles a third of the time, 80% higher lifetime value, a fraction of the cost of customer acquisition. So that's what the Inquisitor podcast will be all about this year. It's the mistakes we as sellers make that cause buyers not to buy, because you absolutely have 100% control over that. And if you stop doing those things, you will free up time to actually think about designing your business properly. So without any further ado, happy selling. And in the meantime, stay safe. Bye-bye.